Welcome to Notes to My Legal Self. The future belongs to builders. Together, we explore topics of interest to legal innovators. Know someone who'd make a great guest? Let us know. Self-nominations are encouraged. They're an act of courage. Want to get the most from this conversation? Ask questions, comment, like, follow, say hello. In short, engage. Lastly, have fun. Shaping the future of law requires significant effort, but finding joy in the process is essential. Let's begin. Here's your host, Olga Mack.
Well, hello, everyone. Today I have a very special episode with somebody that I've known for a long time, who've been practicing law, a very interesting person, and someone I call a friend. So, Collin, without further ado, please introduce yourself and welcome to Notes to My Legal Self, finally.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Number one, that intro is spectacular. Nice to meet everybody. Nice to see everybody. Nice to be here. My name is Collin Williams. I'm the founder and chairman of New Era ADR. We are a virtual ADR platform, making everything simpler, less expensive, more efficient. But we do arbitration mediation just as you would always expect it to be.
I love it. So, how does one get up in the morning and decide to do exactly that? What happened to you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the days of me wanting to be a fireman when I was a kid are out the door. This was originally, I was in private practice for years and then in-house for several years after that. And I just saw a system that was completely broken. I really thought that litigation, both in court and through ADR, was an extraordinarily time-consuming, extraordinarily expensive, and incredibly inefficient. And that's not to knock court. Like court, the dockets are overloaded. Judges have just a ton of work to do. So I'm not knocking court at all. But when I thought of ADR, I thought people wanted something different than going to court. And it just seemed to me that there was better ways to do it. There was more efficient ways to do it. There was better fee models. So that was really what drove me, was to try to change the narrative on dispute resolution and litigation and make it a much simpler, far less scarier process, something that people hated a lot less. So that was kind of the goal.
I love that you wanted to be a fireman. And then you decided to become a litigator, which is basically a fireman of a different sort. And then you decided to be an entrepreneur, which is, frankly, Collin, is a fireman of a slightly different sort as well. So I think you are living your childhood dream.
Yeah, I jumped into the fire. How's that? It's instead of putting it out, I'm sitting in the middle of it.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I love that. You've been vocal about mental illness and, as a lawyer, as a founder, and have become sort of an advocate for this. Tell me how that happened. What inspired you to share, and what experiences have you had to share to inspire others to do something about it?
Yeah. I mean, to be bluntly honest, what inspired me was the fact that I suffer from it. And I won't even say suffer, that's not the right word. I live with it. And it was something that I never knew I had. And I actually had symptoms that probably people wouldn't recognize. I mean, to give you the candid response, I suffer from depression, or I live with depression, but it manifested me in anger. So anybody who thought or thinks that depression means I'm sitting in the corner with downtrodden eyes and I can't function on a daily basis, that wasn't how it manifested for me. For me, it was anger. And I had a lot of trouble controlling my anger. And when I eventually got into counseling, I said, well, these are my symptoms. And it was an aha moment. My therapist immediately said, you have depression. And that was like this just massive opening in my world to say, all right, well, there's a face I can put to this. There's a term. And now it's on me to start understanding it and improve myself. So that was really what got me involved in it. That's what drives me to be such an advocate for it. And I'm sure we're going to talk about a bunch of other things, but that's my why.
I love that. Thank you for first of all, thank you for acknowledging it and sharing openly. I love that you sort of reframed it from suffering to living with it. That's that's a very important reframe. Help me understand when you do that, why you do that, and what shifts in your mind when you do that.
Well, I think when you don't know what's going on and you just think something's wrong with you, that's when you're suffering, right? Because you don't have an answer, you don't have an action plan, you don't have a strategy. When you learn what's going on and you come up with an action plan and you come up with a strategy, you move from suffering to living with. And living with is a-okay. I'll be totally honest with you. It doesn't mean there aren't tough times. It doesn't mean there's not struggles. But at the end of the day, I am living with, I am thriving with, I am enjoying life with, which is a big difference from suffering. And I think when you don't know what's going on, you are suffering. And so part of the narrative here that I always want to pass along to people is life is miserable when you're suffering. Life is great when you're living with. So if you can move between those two stages, you will solve 90% of your problems.
I love that you basically are saying that suffering is a choice.
It is. I want to be, I'm very careful with that because I know so many people just don't know what's wrong. So it is a choice, I think, once you've figured out what's going on with you. But prior to that, it's not as much of a choice. And that's when it's really, really scary. And that's why I think suffering is without question the right term at that time.
I see. No, thank you for correcting and explaining. The other thing that I thought was really interesting that you mentioned that identifying it is actually kind of a big challenge. I'm familiar with depression sort of firsthand, not through my experiences, but by living with somebody who had it and explaining to that person that they have it actually in itself was a challenge and convincing and getting help. That actually was a process for years. And then, you shared that the symptoms you had were which you didn't associate with depression, which is anger. So I'm curious to about what prompted you to seek help and because that's actually the hardest thing at some point. That what begins the journey from suffering to living with it is actually putting a name and a face and all that. How did you get to the point where like I probably need to go get help?
Yeah, that's the simplest answer to any question you're going to ask is my wife. She was wondering what was wrong with me because anger is something, and you just touched on it, right? It's very difficult to define what you have when you don't seem to fit what in your mind are the stereotypical characteristics of what that may be. So like I said, depression, you would tend to think that I wouldn't be functional, that I'd be sitting on a couch, miserable all the time, under the covers, not functioning. That was what in my mind I thought depression was. Completely untrue, right? It can manifest in so many different ways. But my wife recognized my anger. That's not a very difficult thing to see when somebody's mad all the time and being set off by things that shouldn't set them off. So she said, you need to go get help. And I finally agreed after being very, very stubborn about it. And that's a normal thing too. And then it was literally within the first 5 minutes of my first therapy session that I learned this is not just an anger problem. This is a depression problem. But it was the fact that my manifestation was actually making our home life not so good. And her push to say, go get help, do something about this. And that's when I learned, right? With it literally within 5 minutes. And what an aha moment. It's changing my life.
Yeah, it's interesting that your wife convinced you. I actually I've helped somebody to get help, not as a wife, but a family member, and had an opportunity to talk to a therapist when we finally convinced this person to go seek help. And I was told that it's not unusual because it's really hard for yourself to recognize that you have it because you are all you know. And other people who don't know you well, they just think that's who you are. But a person who is very close to you, like your wife, your child, your parents, they actually kind of see you change. They know what's the baseline is, and they know when you're different and when you
Yeah.
become different in an increasingly different way. And so that's when, and that delta is what's wrong because
Yeah.
that's not the person she married, right? Um,
Yes.
and that's when she said, no, there's something wrong. I mean, I'm curious. What actually, what kind of conversation you've had with her, and what actually inspired you to say, okay, fine, I'll do it.
Yeah, I mean, the difficult thing I think is that it's very hard to admit that you're not normal. And I use the word normal in a very, very broad sense because I can't think of anything better to use right now. But you love to think that however you are is the way you should be. And for me, it was starting to notice that my outbursts were being set off by things that should not set off outbursts, right? very, very nominal things in your life that ordinarily would not cause anger were causing great amounts of anger. And it got to the point where my wife just couldn't deal with it. There's concern. I have a son. How's he going to react? Are we going to start to normalize anger? Are we going to start to normalize like expressions of anger, explosions? That was the concern for me because those things shouldn't be normal. That's not what I wanted my son to see. It's not what I wanted my wife to be around. It's not what I wanted our life to be. So that was the conversation is it was never, my wife wasn't like, you have depression. She didn't know. It was just, there's something wrong and you can either deal with it or you can just continue to motor along the way. Once again, it's very, very easy to convince yourself that everything's okay. So if there is something wrong, jumping off that ledge and saying, wait, there's something wrong and I need to go fix it is probably the most difficult step that anybody will take. But for me, that was the thing. I just didn't want it to continue the way it was continuing. And I knew I had to do something. And I didn't know if therapy was the answer, but it turns out it was, in addition to several other things. But it was that moment of admitting, you know what, something is off and I need to deal with it.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And that very much maps with the firsthand experiences I had with somebody else. I'm curious, one of the other experiences I've had was sort of this question of why, where did it come from? Is it an event that triggered sort of the stress of something, and as a lawyer, you have plenty of stress. I mean, in fact, you may argue that your job is sort of absorb the stress and
Yeah.
and help channel it. Or is it genetic? This why and where does it come from was sort of like a pivotal conversation for years. I was that person. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I absolutely do. And what I would say is, I think you need to come to grips at some point with the fact that you may never get the answer to why. So for me, I've struggled with this a bunch. I was a football player all through college. Obviously, back then, there wasn't a lot of information about head injuries, concussions, CTE, all these different things. Now it's very much at the forefront of the sport that, trauma and brain damage and these things exist. So I have struggled a lot with, is it, a result of that? Is it a result of my genetics? Is it a result of my career choice? And the answer is, I have no idea. But I will tell you, I have thought over and over and over again, will I ever get that answer? But the reality is, I think I've come to grips with, I will never know the why. And that's okay. I'd rather deal with the consequences of the why and make my life better and improve than continuing to struggle with the why. Now, maybe there's a clearer answer for some folks, but for
No, but
me,
no, I love that. So I actually want to know, how did you get to sort of, why does it matter as much as how I'll go forward? Because, I've been through the exercise of doing my entire lineage and going, who is the person who gave
yeah,
it
who
to,
caused this?
who is the patient zero, so to speak?
Yep.
And actually for that person, it was very important. So I'm just curious, and we struggle to refocus, from why to forward. You know, what helped you?
I think the realization that I was finally never going to get the answer, right? And maybe there will be an answer if I donate my brain after I die, and somebody can look at the that I have tau proteins in my brain, and then maybe that would be the answer, that it was football. I don't, but I realized that that's not going to happen during my lifetime. And while there's probably some genetic predisposition, and like you said, there's a patient zero somewhere along the genetic line, I don't know that I'm going to find that person. And quite frankly, I don't want to crawl into like my relatives' past and see who may have been suffering through these things. I don't know what answer that will give me. So I finally just came to the conclusion, it's here, it exists, it's with me. It doesn't really matter why. I would love to have the answer to why. But at the end of the day, I have to deal with it and I have to improve. And I need to go looking forward. Looking in the past is not going to help me. So that's how I've kind of come to grips with it. It doesn't mean I don't still think about it, but I just have come to grips with the fact that I'm probably never going to know the why.
Yeah, yeah. I personally find it helpful when I look at sort of where I come from. We tend to look at our past as sort of over romanticizing it or blaming it. It's
Yeah.
really kind of two dimensional. There is, but you know those were people with with all kinds of stuff and circumstances, and they were real three-dimensional people. They were not good or bad. They were just people dealing with their lives, trying to solve problems they had that may not be problem today's. So I just think looking for the past for answer, it has a very limited ability to solve your problems today.
Yeah.
And but when you're searching for why, I think it's really hard to make that switch.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, what I've also come to the conclusion is that there probably isn't one why, right? It's probably sort of an amalgamation of all these different things that have happened, and that includes environment and genetics and things that you've done in the past, and that creates kind of the perfect storm that may result in this. That's at least, I don't know, I don't have any clinical diagnosis that leads me down that path, but that's where I've kind of come out, is that it can't just be one thing. It's got to be sort of a grouping of things that allow this to happen. And so if you're looking for one why, you're going to struggle even more, because it's probably 3 whys or 4 whys that get you to this point.
Yeah, the stars have aligned, so to speak. Let's talk a little bit about impact. I understand it had an impact sort of on personal life, maybe even your practice, but you decided to embark on this really stressful thing called entrepreneurship, and I know so many entrepreneurs. I work with them. I help them. I replace them. Like I've done many things with entrepreneurs for the last 20 years. I've advised them, like all kinds of things. You know, Depression is common among entrepreneurs, first of all, and even if you don't suffer from sort of from anything really, it is a high stress environment. So if you have a dormant condition, there's a really good chance it will be triggered. And even if you didn't have anything, there is a chance it may develop. I've seen both, and sort of dealt with it in many ways. So curious, what is the impact of running an early stage startup? Now you guys kind of, I guess, midway, so maybe not so early, but you definitely had early days.
Yeah.
And there's stresses along the way and triggers along the way. So I'm curious, what is the impact of running a venture backed startup and going through the roller coaster, the adrenaline, and does it have impact on you and your condition?
Really interesting question. I think now that I'm at this phase where I say living with, that it doesn't have as much of an impact. If I was going through this back when I didn't know what was wrong, I don't think I would have had the mental strength to continue. Because, like you've stated, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I will tell you, my path in entrepreneurship is pretty simple, though. I was afraid that I was going to end up being an attorney for 45 years and wake up one day at 75 years old or 80 years old, still sitting at a desk practicing law. So I knew that I wanted to accelerate my path to probably retirement. And that's kind of what drives me. But I will say, now knowing what is wrong with me, treating is a huge part of this. And that includes both therapy and now medicine, allows me to stay very level set, which means that the stresses that are involved in this are just impact me the same way that they would impact anybody who doesn't have depression, because I've reached a point where I am operating at a pretty normal level. Now, had this been back then, I can't even imagine the number of explosions I would have had, the anger I would have had, based on the stressors that come along with, starting a business. But now I feel like I'm pretty capable of handling them. But that's only because I've been very proactive in treating this and haven't just sat around and said, well, it is what it is, and let's just march about our merry way. I think you really, really need to get a handle on these things. And if you can do that, then it's really not going to impact your journey, and you can handle the stresses of entrepreneurship.
I love the entrepreneurship as a fear, as a reason to avoid fears. I could practice law for the rest of my life, or I can do this really crazy thing. Yeah, the crazy thing sounds better. Let's do that.
Yes. Yes. But that's how my mind operates, which is, I never loved practicing law. I think I've been very candid throughout my career about that. I knew when I didn't like going to court that I wasn't going to be a great litigator, or at least it wasn't something that I was going to want to do for the rest of my life. So for me, that is what drives me, is I don't want to just live in the standard. I want to do things. I would rather take a chance on doing something great with the risk associated with it than just saying, I'm just going to stay here all the time. And I know that's very, very difficult for a lot of people, and it's not for everybody. But for me, the idea that I was going to be sitting at that desk for 40 more years was terrifying. And it was way scarier than doing this.
Honestly, sitting at a desk for 40 years is terrifying. And even if you enjoy it, I don't think our bodies are designed to sit at the desk for 40 years. I mean, we would have been designed very differently if we
Yes.
were designed to sit for 40 years. I think it has nothing to do with you or your condition. That has a lot to do that this is not what it's designed for. We're coming to the end. I do want to talk a little bit more about kind of, now that you live with it and you are, running a startup and going through various turbulence and adrenaline rush, are there sort of intentional and conscious designs in your day, in your life, in your interactions with others that you have done to, now that you acknowledge that you live with it, like I live with my cat and it needs to be fed. Yeah, it's really that simple. So I schedule things in my calendar because it starts meowing. He's adorable, demanding cat. So I live with my cat. So it's very different than living with a cat, but in some ways you have to redesign your life when you now live with someone or something. So what changes have you made to live with it?
I think a really, really important part of all of this is maintaining a routine. That's not necessarily for everybody, but for me, I have very structured days outside of my workday because I know when I get into a workday that there's going to be all sorts of curveballs that are thrown at me, and it's going to be, I don't know what's coming, right? Generally, I may know I've got some meetings and I've got some other things going on, but there could always be some wrench that's thrown into the plans during the workday. So outside of the workday, at least during the week, I maintain a very structured environment. I do X at 6:30 a.m. I do Y at 7 a.m. I get through this whole process at night. I've got structure, and that helps keep me sane, right? That helps keep me on a path where if it was all just chaos all the time, I think I would have a lot more trouble dealing with things. And that's not to say that will work for everybody, but for me, having a routine and having sort of a set structure has really helped me keep my head screwed on straight. Because once again, as you've mentioned numerous times, I know during the day that crazy stuff might happen and maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. So at least if I acknowledge within my workday, that's going to be chaotic. Everything outside of it, if it's not, then it's a much simpler life.
Yeah. Have you been open about it with, your partner? I mean your business partner. I don't mean your
Yeah.
wife. With your employees, with your investors, what was that disclosure like, and how that conversation going?
Yeah, I think, yes, everybody on my team, I think, knows I am very candid about it. It's all over LinkedIn, it's on my profile. And once again, for me, that is part of getting rid of the stereotypes and the stigmas that are associated with this. 1 in 5 people, the statistics say, and I will tell you, I think they're incredibly low, that 1 in 5 people suffer from some form of mental illness. So this is not 20% of the population. This is not something that's crazy. It's not something to be embarrassed about. So I'm incredibly vocal, incredibly overt, because I want people to know, hey, you may think of me as a high functioning human being. I got lots of problems, right? And so it's not something I hide. It's something that I tell anybody that will listen. And if people have questions, I will talk about it. And everybody around me knows. And that's because I want them to know. And it's not so much I want them to like feel bad for me or think I'm doing something fantastic by telling people. It's because I don't want in 20 years when my son is, 27 years old, I don't want this still to have the stigma. I don't want people to think, ooh, mental illness, that's crazy. It shouldn't be like that. 20% of the population minimum is suffering from these types of things, not suffering or living with. So for me, I am incredibly overt about this. I will talk about it to anybody who wants to listen. And so I never thought of it as strange. And if nobody's reacted in a weird way, to me, it was never like jumping off a cliff. It was just, this is me, take it or leave it. Doesn't really matter, but it's not something I'm embarrassed about.
I love that. And I love that you're open. And I've also fundraised. And, it's one thing to maybe even tell your partner who, there's a reason why you and your partner started a business. You probably trust each other. You have a relationship. You've had it over time. It's another thing to tell it to your employees. There's sort of, in the end, a power dynamic. But, with investors is different. I think it's a harder conversation. And I'm curious, one, have you had reservations about it? Or have you had conversations with your investors about it? What is the strategy? How did it go? Could it have gone better? Did you get better over time? I just threw like 500 questions at you. So be sure to answer them all thoroughly.
Yes, and in order.
Yeah, do not forget the order.
Yeah, yeah, yes. I never had a direct conversation except with maybe some of the guys at Motivate Ventures who were an early investor with us, just because I knew them a little bit better. One of them I played hockey with. So maybe a little bit more direct conversations with them about these issues, but I don't really recall. I don't remember having a direct conversation with any investors about this particular thing. But I do know I have posted ad nauseum on LinkedIn about these issues and articles I've written and all sorts of different stuff. And throughout that time, the investors have liked those, commented on them. So clearly they're aware of these things. It has never come up during a board meeting. It has never come up during any sort of meeting. Nobody has ever said, hey, I'm a little concerned about investing in your company because maybe you're off your rocker. But it hasn't been a direct thing.
That would be interesting. Oh, really? What does that mean?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't understand what you think that means.
Right, exactly. Like you said before this, it's kind of, you're a little bit off your rocker if you go down this path. But I would say,
Yeah, for the audience in the room, we talked about what it means to be normal, and you said it's not like it's not normal not to have a mental illness. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, being an entrepreneur in a venture-backed company is actually less normal.
yes.
If it then I mean, statistically, I mean, I'm using the word normal in a statistical sense. I'm looking at a normal curve and where 80% of the population lives. We're talking about 20+% having a mental illness of a sort, which is a conservative estimate, versus a very, very teeny tiny numbers of people who start an early stage company, especially in legal tech. I mean, yeah, I think you're an outlier in other ways. Mental illness actually what makes you normal.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I will tell you the way I view this, and I wrote an article for Entrepreneur a while back that said this. To me, this is a superpower. And that's definitely reframing how you think about it. But the reality is, if you're able to acknowledge this and figure out what's wrong with you and deal with it, isn't that a strength? It's not a weakness. And I would think, and maybe it's a question for our investors, I would think that they would view it that same way, which is your ability to overcome obstacles and issues in your life is not a negative, it's a positive. So everybody's got problems, whatever they may be. I'm no different. This just happens to be, possibly the biggest one that I have. But I've worked very, very hard to fix the problem. Fix isn't the right word. To move down the path and live with the problem. And so I would hope that investors would look at that and say, that's a positive, not a negative.
I love that. We are at the end, and you and I could talk all day, and I really enjoyed this company. And, fun fact, I schedule episodes because it's easier to schedule episodes than time to catch up. So I'm so glad we had a chance to catch up. And we've covered so much. For me, probably this, a reframe from suffering from to living with, I think is the biggest takeaway. And I think I will reflect on that. I'm curious, what is the one thing you want to leave folks with, or for them to reflect or do, so that they may or may not have seen the whole thing, or they're trying to piece it all together. But the one takeaway usually helps, so that have an actionable thing to do after this.
Yeah. I think we've used the term normal a lot. The fact that you have a mental illness very much is normal. And I say that once again in the context of the statistics, which say 20% of the population minimum have these issues. So if you think there's something wrong, number one, I want to get rid of the stigma, right? Because if you just look at those numbers, you say, this is not a strange thing. You're not an outlier. There's nothing odd about you. But I also want people to recognize that if you think there's something wrong, don't let the worry about what people are going to think about you stop you from getting help. And there is nothing wrong with going to a therapist. There's nothing wrong with taking medicine. My brother once said, he's a doctor, and he said, this is no different than having a broken arm. Like, what would you do about a broken arm? You wouldn't just sit there and leave it and have it be broken. You would do something about it. And so my takeaway or my leave with is that this is a very normal thing. You're not an outlier. If there's something wrong with you, go get it treated. Don't let the broken arm linger. You will find that your life is vastly improved. And then I would ask you to talk about it, because that's the only way that we're going to make sure that in the future, this is just not an issue. It becomes a non-thing. And that would be my takeaway.
I love it. Living with depression, living with broken arm, living with a cat, whatever, potato. I love it. And then go talk about it. Thank you so much, Collin. This was a fantastic conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you for stopping by. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Notes to My Legal Self. The future belongs to builders. Know someone who'd make a great guest? Let us know. Self-nominations are encouraged. They're an act of courage. Keep in mind, the future of law is all lit up. Let's roll up our sleeves, innovate, build, and change the world of law together. See you soon.